Romans chapter 7:20, the Apostle Paul talks about the sin that dwelleth in me. And we're going to talk more about this a little bit later in the week, but he says in verse 23, a law in my members, warring against the law of my mind. And I took you yesterday to chapter 12 of Romans, where he talks about dealing with the mind. He says transforming the mind, bringing the mind into subjection. In other words, that we don't just allow our minds to just go willy-nilly and just go wherever it wants to go, but we bring it into subjection because we run those things by the spiritual man. And it reminds me every time I teach this, and I often speak to young people about these things, it brings me back to Proverbs chapter 7. And if you've never read Proverbs chapter 7, you probably need to read it. Because Proverbs chapter 7 is a man, he's looking out the window of his house. He says, I'm looking out beyond the casement of my house. In other words, he sees down the street. And he sees, as he describes one of the young men, he calls him one of the simple ones. And he says he's a young man who is void of understanding. And he's walking down the street. He comes to a fork in the street. And he's standing there making a decision. And I think about this when I read this, because this reminds me about life, about that moment of time, that moment of decision, that time that young person stood there and somebody offered them a joint of marijuana or an alcoholic beverage, and they thought about it, and they thought, well, it probably would be better, but I don't want to be not cool. I don't want to not fit in the crowd. I want so much to be accepted by those who are around me. And they make that decision. And then you're out here, you're driving down the street, and you see the person standing there on the corner. Their face is all red, and they got a sign that says, well, why lie? I want a beer. You've seen it. Well, that's that same person that had a decision to make years ago. See, in the story of Proverbs, he says this young man, he stands there at the corner, and then he takes that turn that takes him down the street, and he says, the woman was there dressed as a harlot. And she says, come to my house. She says, I've perfumed my bed with ointments. This Goodman has gone on a far journey, and he won't be back. Come, we'll have our fill. And then it says, and this young man made the decision, and he took the road to hell. Read it. It's an interesting story to read in the book of Proverbs, chapter 7. You see, I see this all the time. I see it in grown people. I see it in young people. It has to do with the war of the mind. This is what the Apostle Paul talks about. He says, the mind is a choice. Do you want to walk the spiritual walk, or do you want to walk the carnal walk? Because everything carnal is screaming out. But it's all about death and destruction, because that's what the devil is all about. It's Pastor Jack King with the gospel on the radio broadcast.